Hoover confers with Hitler 5 years after his presidency. Herbert Hoover toured Europe, mostly to pick up awards for his can-do humanitarian effort to feed the war-ravaged continent in the 1920s. In Berlin, Hoover had a 40-minute chat with Adolf Hitler at the Reich Chancellery in March 1938, then dined with Nazi minister Hermann Göring at his hunting lodge. In his conversation with Hitler, Hoover spoke up for personal liberty. The Führer replied that Germany, unlike resource-rich America, could not afford such liberties. Back home, Hoover denounced the Nazis' disregard for both life and justice, but he argued the United States should stay out of European conflicts with Germany. He thought Hitler posed a bigger threat to Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union than the West. Herbert Hoover left meets Adolf Hitler in Berlin in 1938. Photo, AP, file Roosevelt's wartime meetings with Stalin. Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill met twice with Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin during World War II, to coordinate the fight against Germany. In Tehran in 1943, Roosevelt and Churchill agreed to open up a second front in Western Europe against Germany, while Stalin agreed to launch an offensive in Eastern Europe to divide Germany's resources. Roosevelt, who had granted diplomatic recognition to the Soviet Union in 1933, thought he had won Stalin's confidence with the promise. But Stalin also pressed for concessions about the borders and governments of post-war Poland and the Baltic states. Eastern Europe's fate was a key subject when the wary Allies met again at Yalta in March 1945. Inside the Soviet Crimean seaside resorts, primitive bedbug-ridden palaces, and between Stalin's many long vodka-fueled toasts, Roosevelt and Churchill made concessions to Stalin about Poland's provisional government and borders. They extracted a promise of free elections in Eastern Europe, which Stalin disregarded as soon as he could. From left, Joseph Stalin, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill in 1966. Photo, Saturday Magazine. Kennedy gets bullied by Khrushchev. He just beat the hell out of me, John F. Kennedy said after leaving his summit in Vienna with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev in June 1961. If he thinks I'm inexperienced and have no guts, Kennedy told New York Times columnist James Reston, until we remove those ideas, we won't get anywhere with him. Kennedy, 44 and newly elected, had agreed to meet Khrushchev 5 months into his presidency despite advisors' recommendation he take his time. A belligerent Khrushchev, 67, spent 2 days sparring with Kennedy about Cuba, Laos and Berlin. Afterward, the Soviet told an aide he thought Kennedy too intelligent and too weak. Many historians say that first impression fueled Khrushchev's later confrontations with Kennedy, the Berlin Wall's construction later in 1961 and the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Khrushchev and JFK at their first meeting in Vienna in 1961. Photo, Fairfax Media. Nixon makes history with Joe and late world, watching on TV in 1972, could scarcely believe it. China's communist dictators toasting an American president in Beijing, and Richard Nixon, who had launched his career as an anti-communist, toasting right back. As Nixon toured the Great Wall of China and held long talks with Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, commentators wondered whether he had accomplished much beyond the photo ops. Today that rough draft of history looks entirely wrong. The U.S. relationship with the world's most populous nation seems indispensable, if ever fraught. Washington scored giant pandas for the National Zoo. China got 2 musk oxen in exchange, and a political metaphor, Nixon goes to China, remains a shorthand for how hardliner credibility can build authority for a grand concession. U.S. President Nixon eats with chopsticks at dinner in Shanghai with Premier Zhou Enlai aka Zhou Enlai as he wound up his China visit in 1972. Photo, A Prig in Fates. The ruthless Suharto, Indonesia's ruthless general and president, Suharto, oversaw a massacre of 500,000 leftists as he seized power in the mid-1960s. His 1975 invasion and annexation of East Timor left 200,000 dead. Yet American presidents from Lyndon Johnson to Gerald Ford backed Suharto as an anti-communist force in Southeast Asia. Ronald Reagan kept up the U.S. support, even welcoming Suharto and his wife with a White House state dinner in October 1982. First Lady Nancy Reagan wore a black and white satin dinner gown by Bill Blass, The Washington Post reported. President Suharto waved goodbye, his diamond ring flashing in the night. 4 years later, Suharto returned the favor, hosting the Reagans in Bali during a meeting of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. President Suharto of Indonesia directs U.S. President Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan to take their places prior to a dinner in Bali in 1986. Photo, Apbish smooches with Crown Prince Abdullahiz. This really happened. The two leaders were also photographed holding hands at George W. Bush's ranch in Crawford, Texas, in 2005. Keep in mind that 15 of the 19 hijackers on September 11, 2001, were Saudis. So was the man who ordered the attack, Osama bin Laden. The oil-rich kingdom was then, and remains now, one of the most repressive and religiously intolerant regimes in the world. President Bush left poses with the waving Saudi Crown Prince Abdullah right after the latter's arrival at Bush's ranch in Crawford, Texas, in 2002. Photo. App Clinton refuses to grip and grin with Kim Jong-il. Bill Clinton isn't smiling in the official photograph from his 2009 trip to North Korea. He warned his aides not to smile, too. He was all business, officially there as a private citizen, though his wife was Secretary of State to negotiate the release of 2 American journalists held hostage by the government of Kim Jong-il, father to the current North Korean leader. "We were told that we were going to a meeting," recalled journalist Laura Ling after flying home with the ex-president. "When we walked through the doors, we saw standing before us former President Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton meets Kim Jong-il in Pyongyang in 2009. Photo. KNSAP. Philly. Obama swallows his idealism with Mubarak. For Barack Obama, welcoming Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak to the White House represented a compromise of his foreign policy idealism. Since 1981, Mubarak had ruled Egypt as a military dictator, with broad arrest powers and a record of police state torture. The agenda for Mubarak's August 2009 White House visit was an ever-elusive peace between Israel and the Palestinians, a classic example of presidential practicality in dealing with an oppressive ally. The two men met again in 2010. But Obama reversed course in 2011 amid Egypt's Arab Spring protests, declaring that a transfer of power from Mubarak must begin now. That helped nudge Mubarak out of power, though critics say it led other U.S. allies to doubt American loyalty. Once upon a time, an asset to the West, Hosni Mubarak is hosted by Barack Obama at the Oval Office in 2009. Photo. Reuters. Trump embraces Putin even after the appointment of a special counsel to investigate Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. Trump spent much of July 2017's Group of 20 summit in Hamburg getting to know Russian President Vladimir Putin better. The two leaders stretched a scheduled half-hour meeting into 2 hours, then had an unscheduled hour-long chat with only a Kremlin interpreter present. Trump's best single relationship in the G20 is with Putin, said Ian Bremmer, a consultant who broke news of the second meeting in Vanity Fair. The friendly chat, after Trump's praise of Putin's authoritarian control of Russia, alarmed other summit-goers. U.S. allies were surprised, flummoxed, disheartened, Bremmer said. "You've got Trump in the room with all these allies, and who is the one he spends time with?" President Donald Trump reaches to shake hands with Russian President Vladimir Putin at the 2017 G20 summit. Photo. Evan Vucha. North Korea saw Donald Trump. Kim Jong-un